Welcome to today's Explainer. We're exploring an absolutely foundational moment in history, the Prophet Muhammad's migration. This wasn't just a simple change of address. It was a monumental shift that quite literally laid the groundwork for an entire civilization. So we're going to look at the historical sources to understand exactly how a desperate flight from persecution transformed into an absolute masterclass in state building. Let's get right into it. All right, let's kick things off by testing your knowledge a bit. What was the original name of the famous city we now know as Medina? Take a quick second to guess. Well, if you guessed Al-Ahal, that's actually false. According to historical texts, before the Prophet arrived, this settlement was widely known as Yathrib. It wasn't until this massive migration that its identity was fundamentally, permanently changed to Medina. Now, to really grasp the deep emotion behind this journey, we have to remember the context. The Prophet was literally driven out of Mecca by intense, relentless persecution. He and his followers were actively blocked from spreading Islam in their own hometown. Leaving the place of your birth under that kind of hostility, that is incredibly traumatic, and it makes this prayer about loving his new homeland just so poignant. It really sets the emotional stage for the new society he was about to build. So, here's our roadmap for today. We'll cover the migration to Medina, starting the Hijri calendar, the Muhajirun and Ansar, building the Prophet's Mosque, and finally, the Constitution of Medina. Part 1. The migration to Medina, from persecution to a joyful welcome. Driven out of Mecca, the early Muslims desperately needed a safe haven, a place where they could practice their faith without the constant threat of violence. And in stark contrast to the hostility they left behind, they were met with open arms by the Muslims of Yathrib. As the Prophet arrived, they famously chanted, Tala'a al-Badru al-Layna min Thaniyat al-Wada. That translates to, the full moon rose over us from the Valley of Peace. It's such a beautiful celebratory chant of gratitude. It highlighted the nobility he brought to their city and officially marked the birth of a brand new era of community. Moving on to part 2, starting the Hijri calendar, a new measure of time. This migration was so monumental, so completely transformative, that it literally restarted time for Islamic civilization. The crucial takeaway here is that the word Hijri ties directly back to this specific historical journey. Think about it. Instead of marking year zero by a king's birth or some massive military conquest, the Islamic calendar officially begins with a journey, a profound migration from persecution toward peace. And just think about the sheer scale of that legacy for a second. More than 1,440 years have passed since that precise moment, yet this calendar remains in active, everyday use by Muslims all over the world today. It's literally a living, breathing connection to that historic journey to Medina. Okay, part 3, Muhajirun and Ansar, defining the new community. So when we look at the demographics of this brand new state, we've got people arriving and people who were already there, and they needed to unite these distinct groups into one cohesive society. Notice the perfect contrast between the two foundational pillars of this community. On one hand, you have the Muhajirun. These are the folks who left absolutely everything behind and migrated from Mecca. On the other hand, you have the Ansar, the local residents of Medina from the Aus and Khazraj tribes who provided a safe haven. Building this state depended entirely on bringing these two distinct groups together in true brotherhood. But the city was far from a monolith, It's really important to realize that Medina was a highly diverse, pluralistic landscape. The inhabitants weren't just the Muslim Muhajirun and Ansar. The city was also home to established Jewish tribes and idol worshippers. This demographic reality meant that any new government had to figure out exactly how to manage a diverse society fairly and effectively. Which brings us to part 4. Building the Prophet's Mosque, the first act of state. With the people united, the very next step was laying down the physical and spiritual infrastructure. Now, while Medina today boasts incredible historic landmarks like Mount Uhud, the Al-Baqi Cemetery, and the Quba Mosque, the absolute spiritual and administrative center of this new state was, without a doubt, the Prophet's Mosque. The historical sources detail how the Prophet systematically built the foundations of this state through 4 very deliberate steps. First up, he physically built the mosque himself, working right alongside his companions. Second, he established a clear chain of command by requiring obedience to the leader. Third, he formalized the brotherhood, known as the Muwaha'at, between the migrating Muhajirun and the local Ansar. And fourth, he drafted a formal constitution. The initial physical footprint of this mosque was incredibly humble, which makes looking at its centuries-long expansion just staggering. During the Prophet's own time, the mosque was a mere 2,475 square meters. It grew under the Abbasid Caliph al-Mahdi and then expanded dramatically during the modern Saudi era. I mean, going from roughly 16,000 square meters under King Abdulaziz all the way to a massive 200,000 square meters today under King Salman bin Abdulaziz. That's a phenomenal increase. Thanks to these massive ongoing expansions, millions of Muslims today can comfortably visit this breathtaking site. It stands firmly as the second most sacred place in Islam, right after the sacred mosque in Mecca. Visitors from all corners of the globe come here to pray and, as is highly recommended, to evoke blessings upon the Prophet in the exact same place he helped build with his own hands. It's really special. Finally, Part 5, the Constitution of Medina, the final law. Now, to ensure lasting peace in that incredibly diverse landscape we talked about earlier, the Prophet wrote the Constitution of Medina. This wasn't just a set of loose, optional guidelines. It was a pivotal, formalized legal document outlining the state's core principles. It strictly regulated the relationships between everyone living there, defining exact rights and duties. And yes, this explicitly included the Jewish communities alongside the Muslims. Just look at the core rights outlined for non-Muslims. It specifically recognized and guaranteed both religious freedom and financial freedom. But there was a catch. This was granted based on two very clear conditions. They had to maintain good citizenship, and they couldn't betray or harm Muslims. By guaranteeing these freedoms in exchange for mutual loyalty and security, this constitution was a genuinely revolutionary step in civil rights and early statecraft, a total game changer. When we look at all these historical texts together, the big takeaway is clear. What began as a desperate flight from intense persecution in Mecca ultimately evolved into an absolute masterclass on how to build a unified civilization. Through shared spaces like the mosque, forging real brotherhood between the Muhajirun and Ansar, and drafting a legally binding constitution, Medina became a true beacon of organized, pluralistic society. So I'll leave you with this thought. If a single migration over 1,400 years ago could establish principles of statehood and religious freedom that we still admire today, what visionary solutions might we be completely overlooking in our own modern challenges? The architecture of peace and pluralism built back then in Medina still echoes throughout the Islamic world today. I really hope this explainer has sparked your curiosity to dig into the historical data yourself and learn even more about this incredible journey. Thank you so much for joining me, and keep seeking knowledge.